This question seemed a little bit silly when I first asked it to myself, but I do want to present it here as a, maybe a little bit of an argument, but really more so we're just having a conversation. Is Brock Bowers not going to be the hardest Bulldog to replace in 2024? Right? Obviously, I think Brock Bowers was one of the best college football players over the last 3 years. In his 3 year run, Georgia won a lot, right? And that's the case for a lot of these guys, and it's the case for someone who I'm going to present to you as who I think might actually be the most difficult Georgia Bulldog to replace heading into this next year. But yeah, Brock Bowers. It was amazing. I think you could make an argument that his jersey, that number 19 should be retired for Georgia. Incredible, multiple John Mackey awards, and I think if he didn't get hurt this year, they could have pushed him into being a Heisman Trophy finalist, right? If Marvin Harrison Jr. was a finalist with his numbers, I think Brock Bowers could have been if he got a full season of the production he was putting out this year. But I don't know that he'll necessarily be the most difficult Georgia Bulldog to replace. We saw Georgia was fine without him, right? They could have definitely used him in that game against Florida and that game against Missouri. But there were certain games where Bowers wasn't a big factor, right? I mean, you could go through and cherry pick him and see, oh, he was 3 for 36 this game, right? And that happens. It happens with some of your best weapons. They have games where they're not a super prominent part of the game. Obviously, he was a decoy. But moving on, Ryan Color from Dawg Post talking about who might be more difficult to replace than Brock Bowers. As silly as that sounds to say out loud, newsletter for Dawg Post is in the description down below this video. Every day in your inbox, you get the latest Georgia Bulldog updates. You get the latest opinion stories from us. You get the latest insider stories from us. You get the latest of just what's going on with the Georgia Bulldogs. All of that is encompassed in that link down below for the Dawg Post newsletter. And a quick shout out to Eco Poly. Javon Bullard was a name that I thought about for this. And I was like, his leadership, his tenacity. How many guys are a part of 3 turnovers in a national championship game? Obviously, that game was kind of a slaughter. When you talk about 65-7, what was the score of the Georgia TCU game? 65-7. He was a big part of that. He was a big part of Georgia's secondary the last couple of years. He's a guy who, quote unquote, ate off the floor. He was a guy that embodied all of that. He was a guy who led the charge in having all of the star players for Georgia, or almost all the star players for Georgia, play in the Orange Bowl. I'm going to make my little argument for Cedric Van Pran, though. Georgia center the last 3 years, made 44 consecutive starts for the Dogs in 2021. While Cedric Van Pran, obviously it's more than just Cedric Van Pran, and when, in terms of an offensive line, it's always going to be more than Cedric Van Pran. But the center is a position that the ball starts with them. And that transition from the snap of the ball from the center to the quarterback, every play starts with them. But Cedric Van Pran was a lot more than that. And I know that when you look at, like I have a couple stats that I want to pull up. And when you look at these stats, obviously it's for an offensive line, it's not just one guy because there's 5 players, right? There are 2 guards, 2 tackles as well. But the numbers are impressive. And, hey, man, Georgia's offense was competing for Joe Moore Awards the last 3 years. Part of that's because of Cedric Van Pran. So, look, I'm making the argument that Cedric Van Pran might actually be the most difficult Georgia Bulldog to replace in 2024, noting that, yes, you can't replicate Brock Bowers. You just can't replicate what Brock Bowers did. There aren't a lot of tight ends that are capable of playing the way that Brock Bowers does. There's a reason why he's going to be a top 15 pick in this NFL draft. If he slips past 15, I'd be shocked. I think he definitely can go in the top 10. That's totally possible for Bowers. One of the best players that ever threw on the red and black and the silver breeches. But how often do you get a center that started 44 games, maybe the least problematic player on the team the last 3 years? Not that there were a ton of problematic people, but can you think of a guy who just was... Have you ever heard a Cedric Van Pran press conference? If you listen to a Cedric Van Pran press conference, just look one up after this. And I've had personal conversations with Cedric as well, and just very mature young man. All he cares about are his goals and his brothers, and the leadership is something that you just can't replicate. I'm going to recycle a quote that I used in a video the other day, and I'm going to fly through it so it's not as much. But Kirby talked about Cedric Van Emburgh after the Orange Bowl and after he was asked about his 44th consecutive start. This is what Kirby said about Cedric. Yeah, that's hard to do. 44th start is incredible in this league. The amount of physicality on the offensive line and defensive lines in our league is brutal, and he stayed healthy. He competed. He's probably one of the best leaders I've ever been around. And he went on to say that Cedric Van Emburgh will get the most votes that past year in leadership. They chose Cedric Van Emburgh as a sophomore to represent Georgia at SEC Media Days. He was chosen to represent Georgia in back-to-back SEC Media Days. I don't know how many people, not just Georgia, but in general at these Media Days, are chosen to do that in 2 years. If you're not aware with about what SEC Media Days is, it's the pregame. You're going out with your friends. I'm making a drinking analogy. You're going out with your friends. You have a little pregame at somebody's place beforehand. You're getting a few drinks in you, so you're not spending as much at the bar. That's what SEC Media Days is. It's the pregame heading into the college football season because there is no preseason. And Cedric Van Emburgh was represented to be the guy hyping up the pregame, the guy speaking on everyone's behalf at the pregame. Maybe as I went through, that analogy was not as good as I wanted it to be, but you get what I'm saying. And here's a few other things that people have said about him, right? Jim Nagy, NFL draft analyst. Teams tend to wait a little bit for centers, but I think Cedric's going to be in that range this year when he decides to come out. He's proven at a really high level. What separates him from a lot of undersized centers is just play strength. The guy's really strong. He can play squared like scouts like to talk about inside guys that can play squared and not get their edges powered through. He's good at the second level. Tate Ratledge said it was a love for the game I've never seen from anybody before. Last night and this was back in August, last night we were in there watching film with him until 10 o'clock. He sits there and picks out stuff that you would never think to look at. Now, comparing this to Brock Bowers, you could go through and find the quotes from Nick Saban, from Kirby Smart, from everybody and anybody about Brock Bowers, about how there's nobody like him. And I just think I almost feel like I'm sounding dumb saying this, but I think it's harder to find a good center than a good tight end. And Georgia's got some guys that they know are good at tight end. And you got an Oscar Delp behind that can at least fill in that role and help block and help get some big third down catches. And I think that he could have a really solid year for Georgia. Jared Wilson is the guy that's most likely going to take over for Georgia at that center position. And I'm not saying that Jared Wilson is not going to be as good, but there's less known about him than Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky and Pierce Spurlin, who have gotten more time and gotten the ball in their hands. Obviously, Jared Wilson has subbed into the game. Georgia's offensive line, right? Let me get this number back up. The 3 years that Cedric Van Emburgh was the starter, and this is according to team rankings, Georgia allowed 1.1 sacks per game in 2021. That was number 7 in the country. In 2022, they were 3rd in the country with 0.6. Georgia's offensive line was even better in 2022. 2023, it dips back down, but 9th in the country with a sack a game. Top 10 in protecting the quarterback over Cedric Van Emburgh's 3 years as Georgia's leader on the offensive line. And now Georgia's had some NFL offensive linemen next to him: Jamar Salyer, Broderick Jones, Amarius Mims, right? Georgia's had NFL guys next to Cedric Van Emburgh, and it's a unit thing, but I think it's hard to replicate the leadership, the consistency. Never got hurt, was someone that they counted on, was someone that, I'll reference this again, that South Carolina halftime, Georgia's down 10 at home to the Gamecocks. Obviously not a very good South Carolina team. And Cedric Van Emburgh is one of the guys that's getting people ready in the locker room. And I think back to the Vanderbilt game. If you're not aware of sideline etiquette, right, you can't really go through the sideline if you're a photographer on the field. And for this game, I was shooting on the field. So Vanderbilt Stadium, little janky, undergoing construction, not a great stadium, but you're going through Georgia's sideline to get back and forth. There's not really a way to go around them. I'm bumping shoulders with players as I'm trying to get to the other side, and Georgia wasn't having a great game. Brock Bowers got hurt that game, right? At this point, Brock Bowers had already been hurt. Who was the one on the sideline trying to fire everybody up, trying to calm down the people that need to be calmed down. I saw Cedric Van Emburgh just going around and doing whatever he needed to do to talk to people. It was Cedric Van Emburgh, right? He took accountability and lead as a leader for Georgia. So I think he's really, really hard to replace. Is he going to be harder than Brock Bowers? I don't know. I think we saw Georgia win without Brock Bowers, and I think that they'll continue to win without Brock Bowers, and I do think that he was an absolute freak. But Cedric Van Emburgh, going to be hard to replace. I just wanted to at least have that conversation. I'm not necessarily making the argument, but I'm making that conversation happen. Thank you for watching. Those links are down below.